Ever wonder what work looked like in Canada before modern machines and technology took over? Our towns once relied on jobs that might sound odd to us now, but they were a normal part of everyday life. From lamplighters on the streets to icemen delivering blocks of ice, these workers kept Canadian communities running. They may be gone today, but remembering them is like opening a window into our past. From pinsetters to wharfingers, let's look back at the old Canadian jobs that sound unbelievable now, but were once completely real. Roads and bridges in early Canada weren't free. They were privately funded turnpikes, and toll collectors made sure travelers paid their way. In the 1800s, booths dotted major routes in Ontario and Quebec, with collectors charging fees for horses, wagons, or livestock passing through. The work meant long hours in lonely shacks, sometimes facing angry farmers who resisted the charges. These tolls helped finance road construction at a time when the government lacked the means. By the early 20th century, provinces began taking over roads and abolishing tolls, though bridges like the Halifax and Angus L. MacDonald kept collectors employed much longer. With electronic passes now handling the task, the human toll collector has vanished. Still, their booths once stood as gateways across Canada's growing network of roads. Down at Canada's busy 19th century waterfronts, there was always one figure making sure order was kept, the Wharfinger. This old maritime title referred to the person in charge of a wharf, responsible for docking ships, collecting fees, recording cargo, and often settling disputes. In bustling ports like Halifax, St. John, or Victoria, a wharfinger's ledger might track lumber, cod, or coal flowing in and out by the ton. The role was part administrator, part peacekeeper, ensuring commerce flowed smoothly during Canada's early years of trade. As port authorities and modern harbor commissions took over in the 20th century, the job title slowly disappeared. Though the word itself sounds almost whimsical today, the wharfinger once stood at the heart of Canada's maritime economy, keeping the nation's lifelines of trade in steady motion. While the Iceman delivered blocks door to door, it was the Icehouse Worker who kept the supply in order. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Canadian towns built massive insulated storage barns where winter-cut ice could last well into the summer heat. Workers had to stack slippery blocks layer upon layer, packing them tightly with sawdust or straw to prevent melting. It was heavy, cold, and exhausting labor, often done in dim light with soaked clothes freezing against the skin. Ice houses were common across Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes, serving households, breweries, and fisheries. By the 1930s, with mechanical refrigeration taking over, these workers found their livelihood melting away. Today, only a handful of restored ice houses remain, silent monuments to the Canadians who once hauled winter into the heat of July. There was a time when every phone call in Canada relied on a human touch. Switchboard operators, often women, sat at long rows of cords and plugs, manually connecting callers to their destinations. Starting in the 1880s, they became the voice behind the country's growing communication network. In small towns, operators knew everyone's names and could even pass along urgent news before radio or television. In larger cities like Toronto or Montreal, they managed thousands of calls daily, speaking quickly, politely, and with perfect clarity. The role was demanding but respected, a gateway for women into paid employment. By the 1960s, automated exchanges had replaced most operators, though some rural boards lasted longer. It's hard to imagine now, but for decades, Canadian voices traveled thanks to the calm efficiency of these unseen professionals. Railway maintenance in Canada once fell to groups of laborers nicknamed Gandy dancers. Their job was to lay, align, and repair tracks by hand, often in remote and unforgiving landscapes. Swinging heavy tools in rhythmic unison, crews tamped ballast and adjusted rails to keep trains safe. Immigrant workers, including many from Eastern Europe and China, formed the backbone of these teams across the prairies and Rockies. In winter, section hands braved deep snow and bitter cold, while summer brought blistering heat and swarms of insects. The nickname likely came from the tools they used, supplied by the Gandy manufacturing company. By the mid-20th century, mechanized equipment gradually replaced the gangs of men. Still, without their muscle and rhythm, Canada's great rail expansion could never have tied together such a vast country. When wood and coal were the heart of Canadian heating, chimney sweeps were an essential part of every town and city. Their job was to clear soot and creosote from narrow flues, preventing dangerous chimney fires. In 19th century Canada, sweeps were often young boys or poor men, climbing through cramped, filthy spaces that ruined their lungs and clothes. Cities like Halifax, Montreal, and Ottawa saw constant demand, especially in winter when fireplaces and stoves burned day and night. Though less notorious than their British counterparts, Canadian sweeps still faced the same health risks and low pay. By the early 20th century, central heating systems and new building codes made their work obsolete. Today, the figure of the chimney sweep feels like something out of folklore, yet once they were as common as milkmen on Canadian streets. Before newspapers were cheap and radios widespread, Canadian communities often relied on the town crier to spread the news. Dressed in official garb and ringing a handbell, the crier would stand in public squares calling out government notices, local bylaws, or market updates. In early settlements, especially in Atlantic Canada, criers were the link between officialdom and ordinary citizens. They read proclamations about new taxes, incoming ships, or even lost property. Because literacy rates weren't always high, their booming voices ensured everyone knew what was happening. By the late 19th century, newspapers and telegraphs made the role unnecessary, though many towns kept them on for ceremonial occasions. Today, town criers appear mostly at festivals or heritage events, but their echoes remind us how Canadians once heard the world long before the click of a screen. On the streets of Canadian cities in the 1800s and early 1900s, the rag-and-bone man was a familiar sight. Pushing a cart or driving a horse-drawn wagon, he collected scraps no one else wanted: rags for paper mills, bones for glue factories, and bits of metal for resale. Families would save their odds and ends, trading them for a few coins or even small trinkets. In Toronto, Halifax, and Montreal, these men were the early recyclers, long before the blue bin system. It was a job born of necessity, often taken by the poor or new immigrants trying to get by. As Canada modernized and waste disposal became organized, the rag and bone man disappeared. But his call on the street was once as common as the bread wagon or milk delivery. Standing watch where sea met shore, the Canadian Lighthouse Keeper lived one of the loneliest jobs in the country. From Newfoundland's rugged coast to the stormy shores of British Columbia, keepers tended lamps, wound clockwork, and polished lenses to guide ships safely through the night. Families often lived in isolation, cut off by weather for weeks at a time. Some stations, like Peggy's Cove or Pachena Point, became legendary for the dedication of their keepers. The work was dangerous, especially during storms when lights had to be maintained at all costs. By the 1970s, automation began replacing humans with electric beacons and radio signals. While a few staffed lighthouses remain in Canada, the classic image of the keeper watching the horizon is now a chapter of maritime history, not an everyday sight. In Canada's growing cities of the early 20th century, stepping into a tall building almost always meant meeting an elevator operator. These attendants worked the manual levers that controlled lifts, stopping precisely on each floor while greeting passengers. In places like Montreal's Sun Life Building or Toronto's Royal York Hotel, operators wore uniforms and added a touch of formality to urban life. They were more than just drivers. They gave directions, shared gossip, and added a human presence to otherwise mechanical travel. The job demanded precision, as a careless stop could jar riders or damage the lift. Automatic systems slowly took over in the mid-1900s, phasing operators out by the 1970s. Today, only heritage hotels or government buildings occasionally keep them, a nostalgic nod to a time when elevators felt almost theatrical. Bowling was a popular pastime across Canada in the early 20th century. But before machines took over, every strike meant extra work for the pin boy. Young boys, and sometimes girls, crouched at the end of lanes, resetting pins by hand and rolling balls back to players. The work was fast, noisy, and often dangerous, as stray balls could fly at any moment. In cities like Winnipeg, Calgary, and Toronto, alleys hired dozens of pinsetters, paying only a few cents per game. For many kids, it was pocket money in an era before part-time jobs were common. The invention of the automatic pinsetter in the 1950s swept the role away almost overnight. Though forgotten by most, the laughter of bowlers once depended on those quick, unseen hands working in the shadows. Inside cigar factories of the early 1900s, workdays could be long and monotonous, but some Canadian shops borrowed a tradition from Cuba, the Lector. Paid by the workers, not the owners, this reader sat on a platform and read aloud newspapers, novels, and even political speeches to keep hands and minds engaged. In cities like Montreal, where cigar production thrived, lectors introduced immigrants to Canadian news and culture while sparking debates across the factory floor. They weren't just entertainers, they helped shape literacy and community spirit in a time before radios became common. Factory owners often disliked them, fearing they spread radical ideas, but workers cherished the practice. As radios and labor reforms arrived in the 1930s, the Lector faded from Canadian factories, leaving behind an almost theatrical glimpse of working-class life. For generations of Canadians, summer comfort arrived on the back of a horse-drawn wagon, the Iceman. After winter harvests from rivers and lakes, blocks of ice were stored in sawdust-packed houses, then delivered daily to keep iceboxes cool. Children often chased the Iceman's cart for chips of ice on hot afternoons, a memory many older Canadians still recall. In cities like Ottawa and Winnipeg, ice delivery was a year-round occupation, with men hauling heavy blocks into kitchens, basements, and corner stores. It was grueling, cold work, demanding strong backs and steady endurance. By the 1940s, electric refrigerators slowly made the Iceman obsolete, though some rural communities held on to the service longer. The image of the Iceman wiping his brow in the July sun remains one of Canada's most nostalgic snapshots of daily life. Before alarm clocks became cheap and reliable, early risers in Canadian towns sometimes depended on a knocker-up. Armed with a long pole or even a pea shooter, this worker would tap on bedroom windows to wake factory hands, railwaymen, or miners before dawn. The practice came from Britain, but found its way into Canadian industrial towns in the late 1800s, especially where mill shifts started early. Customers paid a small weekly fee for the service, trusting the knocker-up to be more reliable than roosters or pocket watches. In places like Hamilton or St. John, these human alarm clocks were part of the rhythm of working-class life. As alarm clocks became affordable in the 1920s and 30s, the role disappeared almost overnight. Still, it's a quirky reminder of how Canadians once started their mornings. At dusk in 19th century Canadian cities, lamplighters walked their rounds, carrying ladders and long poles to ignite the gas lamps lining the streets. Each evening, they turned darkness into a patchwork of flickering light, and at dawn, they returned to snuff the lamps out. In Montreal, Toronto, and Halifax, lamplighters were not just workers but part of the city's daily rhythm, moving from block to block as neighbors nodded in greeting. The job demanded precision and routine, with hundreds of lamps to tend in all weather. By the 1910s, electricity gradually ended the tradition, replacing gaslight with the flip of a switch. Though long gone, lamplighters remain a romantic image of old Canadian streetscapes, where one person's nightly walk brought safety and a sense of community to the gathering dark. And that brings us to the end of our look at the jobs that time has left behind. If you enjoyed this walk through history, make sure to give the video a like, subscribe for more dives into the culture, traditions, and everyday lives that shape the world we know today. Catch you in the next one.